had more than 50 whales frolicking in front of the city. And you can see all the spouts going off like 4th of July fireworks. What a country. But you see, people saw this for every spring, every fall. Somebody, thousands of years ago, had to say to his buddies, I bet we could catch one of those. Now those whales are the size of this wall. And you're in a canoe the size of these 5 chairs. You know what his buddies said? You're crazy. That would be the only logical, right? And you have a harpoon, 5-foot, 6-foot harpoon with a Stone Age tip on the front. You're going to paddle out to get close to one of those seagoing monsters with this harpoon. And where are you going to poke it? Think about it. A fatal stab in the tail will only arouse the ire of this beast, right? And it turns out the only place that you can kill a bowhead whale with a spear is in the center of its forehead. Which means you've got to get this little skin boat out into the ocean, and not just out into the ocean, and not just close to the whale, but maneuver around to the very front of the whale, and hit it in the forehead with your spear. And the whale has to hold still for this. First of all, the whale can simply swim away. It will swim faster than you can possibly row your kayak. It's obvious, that's clear. When you get close, that's when it gets really dangerous. The whale can slap your boat with its tail or a fluke. It turns into toothpicks and you're in the frozen ocean. The whale can breach. It can come out of the water, nose pointed toward the sky, and belly flop onto the surface of the sea, creating such a wave that will capsize your boat. And most obviously, to escape capture, all the whale has to do is dive. Once it's 3 feet underwater, your harpoons are useless. For 10,000 years, the Inuit people have survived on this harvest of whales. You cannot convince them that it wasn't a gift. Now you bring the Christian gospel into this. Where's the most obvious place? We who are Orthodox, if you just think about this for a few minutes, you can understand how the Valam missionaries, after learning all of this, what I just told you, it took them months, of course, to piece all this together, but once they had the picture, once they had stepped inside that beam of light, once they understood how these people saw the world, then you say, we believe the same thing as you. Because the pattern that you have seen in all the animals is a pattern we have come to tell you is true of God. We celebrate this on Great and Holy Saturday. Think about it for a minute. Once a year, in place of the cherubic hymn, we sing the hymn, "Let all mortal flesh keep silent, and in fear and trembling, pondering nothing earthly like. For the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, comes to be slain, to give himself as food to the faithful." You see how that made perfect sense? Why the people, when they understood our faith, said, well, that's what we've always believed. Only you're telling us what we believed about all the animals is true of God himself. And that God has done this. He comes to give himself to us as food. You see how that resonated with Alaska Native peoples the way even our people in Europe who were growing wheat and corn might not have gotten it nearly so clearly as the Aleuts, the Eskimos, and the Indians of Alaska did. It just made sense to them. And that's why we can talk about Mr. Baranoff and the exploitation of native labor and Shelikov and his abuses and the rest. It's true, there were about 30 years in the center of the Russian era where the Alaska Native people were badly treated, and you could go so far as to say enslaved. But during that same time, Father Herman came and was the whistleblower, writing letters back to the authorities in Russia and saying that what these people are doing is criminal and should be arrested. We venerate Father Herman in our own liturgical text as a pious and holy monk, and he certainly was. But during his life, there were only two sort of miracles. There was the forest fire that ravaged the island, and he drew with a spade or a stick a line in the sand and said to the children, "Don't worry, the fire will not pass this point, will not cross this line." And it didn't. It was a kind of prophetic miracle. And there was the tidal wave, the tsunami, and he put the icon of the Mother of God on the beach, and again reassured everyone in the community the water will not come any higher than this spot. Those are the only two miracles of Father Herman during his lifetime. That wasn't enough for the people to venerate him as a holy man, as a saint. They venerated him as a holy man, as a saint, because he had the courage to stand up for them. He continued to write his letters back to Russia and complain about the mistreatment of the native people, which is why he moved to Spruce Island, by the way. He didn't move there because he was looking for a prettier forest. He moved there because they tried to kill him in Kodiak. He had to get out of town. So we're not going to Kodiak. Kodiak has had, we could say, three saints. Father Herman is the most important and most famous. Father Juvenali, his colleague, a higher monk who also came from Valam, Finland, walked across Siberia, 8,000 miles, sailed to Alaska, and then went to the mainland to evangelize the tribes, and was never heard from. In the American histories, they say he was seduced by an Indian woman, and when he refused to marry her, since he was a monk, they killed him. None of that is true, by the way. But that's the story that was. Somebody concocted the diary of Father Juvenali. It's in the translator's handwriting. It's not in Father Juvenali's. The original diary never existed. It's all fabricated, made up. But that's the report. We've learned from the native people of Alaska, however, that he made it as far west as to the Yupik area, and he arrived in a kayak with a guide who was showing him the way, because no Europeans had been there yet. It's that early, 1790s. And they encountered a group of hunters, Yupik hunters, Eskimo hunters, among whom was a shaman. And the shaman immediately was troubled by the approach of this canoe, in which there was a Russian higher monk in his early or mid-30s. He was a widower. His wife had died. He had entered the monastery after his wife's death. He'd only been a monk a few years and only been ordained in order to go to Alaska. He was a brand new priest, really. Just this one man and his guide and the hunting party, all of whom had arms, bows, arrows, spears. They were alarmed. It's hard to figure why that was true. But as their canoe approached, the shaman said to the others, "Chase him away." And it's hard to say what that meant. Raise your fist, show your weapons, make hostile gestures, whatever it was. Whatever they did didn't work. The canoe kept coming. So the shaman gave the order, "Kill him." And Father Juvenali was standing in the canoe and was killed with a hail of arrows and fell into the canoe. And his guide jumped overboard trying to escape. But it's at the mouth of the river. It's like the Columbia River, not far from here. It's several miles wide. The Yupiks were amazed because they don't swim themselves. The water's too cold. Hypothermia will get you before you can drown. So they saw this guy swimming, and they had to get into their kayaks and chase him down, and they killed him too. Then the shaman pulled the canoe ashore and removed Father Juvenali's, specifically brass cross, and put it on him. He tried to do some kind of magic or seance or ceremony. Instead, he felt himself levitated. He tried 3 times and finally gave up, removed the cross and tossed it aside, and said, "I don't know what this is, but there's some power here I can't deal with." And that was the end of the oral tradition, as I heard it many times. Years later, a colleague of mine was in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania at the Moravian Brethren Seminary's archives and came across a report from the first Moravian Protestant missionary to go to that same village. And he writes in the 1880s, 100 years after. Apparently I'm not the first missionary to come here. People here say that there was a Russian priest here long ago. He came along the coast in a little canoe. The shaman got alarmed and tried to chase him away. He was killed in a hail of arrows. His guy tried to swim across the river. He swam like a seal. It's word for word what I heard 100 years later. The Moravian missionary wrote down 100 years ago, 100 years after Father Juvenali's, but it's verbatim the same report. I had an icon painted of Father Juvenali standing in his boat because my nephew moved to that village. I said to him, Michael, keep your ears open in case anybody in Quinahog tells that story. A few years went by and he came back to me. I heard them tell that story the same way. The canoe along the beach, the shaman, the hail of arrows, the guy jumping in, swimming like a seal, except for one thing, the way I heard it. Just before they killed the priest, it looked to the native people on shore like the priest standing in the canoe was chasing away flies. Was he really chasing away flies just before he died? Was he worried about mosquitoes at that point? But they had never seen anyone. He was either praying, quickly, right, or blessing them. Either way, it's a perfectly believable detail. Nobody made that up later on. That's exact. You see what I'm saying? So we can say now, Father Juvenali, who came to Kodiak from Valla, Finland, died as a martyr for the faith, in a case of what you could call mistaken identity, because the question still remained, why did they kill him? He was unarmed, he wasn't any threat to them. And then, Smithsonian Institute, 10 years ago, my wife and I went to see the Yupik collection, thousands of artifacts. We opened a drawer, and it was filled with chains. Not metal chains like we would have on a priest's cross. Ivory chains, but not like this. Ivory carved as links. And the explanation was, shamans in Alaska made ivory chains in imitation of Siberian shamans who wore metal chains. So I think it's safe to assume the shaman was alarmed by Father Juvenali's approach. Since he was wearing a metal chain, they assumed he was a shaman from the other side. How do you protect yourself from the power or magic of an intruding alien shaman? Either keep them far enough away that they can't do you any harm, or if they get too close in self-defense, you kill them. And that's why Father Juvenali and his Athabascan Indian guide are saints. Because as I learned in seminary, anyone who dies for Christ, whether baptized or not, is automatically a saint. So Father Juvenali, and now who was the swimmer? Not a Yupik. If the guy had been a Yupik Eskimo, he could have called to those guys on the shore, hey cousin, don't shoot, I'm from your other neighboring village. But Yupik people don't swim. He's from another tribe that does swim. The Oneida Indians, the last villages where Father Juvenali preached before he headed in that direction. You piece it all together. We not only have Father Juvenali as a martyr, we also have his unknown guide or helper, who also perished trying to bring the gospel to the neighboring tribe and was killed in the river. So those are the first saints of our country, of our land. Father Herman and Father Juvenali and his companion. Kodiak has one other saint. I'll talk about him tomorrow. He's a 20th century man from what is today Poland. Anybody here like me who have ancestors who are from villages that now, my grandmother's village is technically actually within Poland today, just barely, but it's in the Carpathian Mountains, but it's in the part of the mountains that are in Poland. And this man was from Poland. He came to the United States as a little boy to New York City. And it just happened the Bishop of Alaska was at St. Nicholas Cathedral in New York City on that same day. And the little boy sang with the choir, I assume, because at the end of the liturgy, when they came to receive the bishop's blessing and venerate the cross, the bishop said to this 9-year-old boy, young man, you have a beautiful voice. If you ever become a priest, I have a parish for you. 10 years later, after he graduated seminary and married, he showed up. And the bishop had a parish for him. Afognak, Alaska. And they spent, I think, a decade there and had 4 kids, and it was cold, and his matryoshka really didn't like the climate. So they petitioned to move someplace further south. And they were assigned to Osceola Mills, Pennsylvania. As anyone from Pennsylvania knows, the town that has usually the coldest record every day of the winter. So they went from Kodiak, where the climate is fairly mild, to Osceola Mills, where it was bitterly cold. And so they tried one more parish in Alberta. And they wound up going back to Europe because they couldn't find, I believe, a warm spot anywhere. And that's where he lived out the rest of his life and was martyred. But that's the 20th century story. I don't want to get too far ahead. We'll continue tomorrow, Father?
Tomorrow, yeah, tomorrow evening maybe, or
With more stories from Alaska. But welcome, we'll enter Alaska morning sometime while you're sleeping. Alaska is an Aleut name. It means the great land. So welcome to the great land and the land of the real people.
Thank you.